Hi, my name is Ailish Campbell. I'm joining you from Finance Canada with the federal government. Hope you had a great coffee break. It is my absolute honor to introduce Joe Powell, who's joining us from the Open Government Partnership Support Unit, where he's the executive director. I hope you've had a chance to check out Joe's bio online. Three amazing themes really jump out at me. First of all, his work is international and has global significance. So it's really fantastic that he's able to join us here in Ottawa, in Canada today, to talk about what he's seeing globally and where Canada fits into international trends. Second thing that really jumped out at me is the fact that Joe has been at the epicenter of some really interesting networks between government and civil society. Whether it's his work with Open Government or at One, Joe has been active at the G8, the G20, bringing citizens closer to government, and frankly, pulling governments closer to citizens, which I think is a huge piece of democratic service. And the third piece is empowering citizens through digital tools. I had the honor to talk a little bit at the break with Deb Matthews, the Minister from Ontario, and we were just discussing how it really feels like Canada is at a tipping point of increased collaboration digitally, both at different orders of government, cities and provinces, but also understanding how interactions between those orders of government can improve services and put citizens really at the heart of what we're doing, which frankly is the whole reason that governments exist and continue to be given power. So please join me in welcoming Joe. He's going to do a 15 to 20-minute presentation. Then we're going to have a bit of discussion and open things up for collaboration with you. Please join me in welcoming Joe to the stage. Thanks.
Thanks, Ailish, and thanks for the invitation to share some of the learnings from the Open Government Partnership. And I just wanted to start, I guess, by quickly reminding people who we are. It would be forgivable not to know what OGP is. It's a very young organization. We started in 2011 with a group of 8 heads of state and 9 civil society leaders. And they came together because they felt like something was broken in terms of multilateral cooperation and multilateral organizations. They felt like there was a gap for an organization that was really driven by citizens and civil society demands, and one that was rooted in the belief that in every government around the world there are reformers who want to do the right thing. And they also understood that transparency, accountability, and participation were no longer optional. As I think Don was saying yesterday, they are absolutely fundamental to what a government should be doing. But they also thought that we needed an organization that did not have a one-size-fits-all model for every country in the world, or even every local government within a country. They thought that open government priorities would always vary from place to place, and I know that there's been a lot of talk around definitions and so on, but I think for us, we've always been quite relaxed that people will interpret open government differently in their own jurisdiction, as long as it's rooted in those values of transparency, accountability, and participation. And almost 5 years after OGP was created, citizen trust or lack of trust in government remains one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. Millions of people are marching against corruption in Brazil, in Guatemala, in Romania, and many other places. And citizens are demanding something which is more responsive. And we believe open government is part of the answer to that. And there has been some positive momentum. So since the 8 founding countries in 2011, we've grown fast. We now have 69 countries and thousands of civil society organizations engaged across the world. And what they're doing together is really, actually, I would say, moving beyond collaboration to actually co-create individual policy reforms that are relevant to that context. Now, many of those reforms, as you can imagine, with over coming up to 2,500, not all of these are transformational, ambitious. At the beginning especially, a lot of them were, frankly, technical, internally focused with an unclear openness dimension. So what we tried to do as OGP grew is encourage stronger implementation of commitments on paper, so they don't just remain in action plans and policy documents, but they actually get implemented, more sharing across international borders, and deepening the interaction between civil society and government to move beyond consultation to true co-creation, collaboration, and even co-implementation of these reforms. And I think there have been a number of very exciting examples here. And I think, as Wayne said yesterday, it's citizens wanting more than a voice, it's wanting a role in government. So I wanted to just give a concrete example of what these reforms look like, because it can seem very technical, of course. These are some of the areas where we've seen some of the most interest from governments and civil society. And our hope is that we will move, as I said, to seeing OGP as a space where we're tackling some of the biggest public policy challenges in that society. So we want to see corruption being tackled through OGP in Brazil, in Guatemala, in Romania. We want to see access to justice and reform of the police being tackled in the US and Mexico. We want to see money laundering being tackled in the UK and the City of London and Ukraine. And here we've seen that OGP has been a place where a light has been shone on extractive industry payments, and that could even go further. So what do these examples actually look like at the country level? I wanted just to tell three very quick stories. We were discussing last night how you communicate the impact of some of these things to political leaders, but also to the public. This picture is from Ukraine, where the KGB archives have been under seal at the Ministry of Justice since the end of communism. The KGB had huge, extensive archives on phone surveillance, on missing persons, on political records and other forms of surveillance. And really, for Ukraine to move on from that period, civil society was demanding that these archives become open. So this is Volodymyr Vyatrovich, who was formerly a campaigner to release these archives and is now the director of the Institute of National Memory in Ukraine. In their last OGP action plan, the Ukrainian government set an ambitious goal to draft a law in cooperation with civil society that would allow the opening up of the communist-era archives, which were closed for decades. In the beginning of April 2015, the government submitted the draft law to Parliament, and it was passed in a matter of days. The law mandates that security and law enforcement agencies transfer all relevant historical files to a special state archive under the Institute, and that archive will cover information about the entire struggle for Ukrainian independence in the 20th century, including political persecutions and human rights violations. So this reflects a significant break from the past in Ukraine and an opportunity to move on. So when people say open government, it's somewhat esoteric or theoretical or academic. I think there are examples out there that we can really explain why this absolutely fundamentally matters to citizens. My second example is from Ireland. As many of you know, the Irish economy crashed dramatically in 2008. Unemployment tripled after an economic bubble that was founded on low regulation, low taxation, and a booming property sector. After the crash and the unraveling and the kind of investigation into why it happened so much harder in Ireland than other places, it was revealed that Bertie Ahern, the former finance minister in Taoiseach, had accepted payments from millionaire developers and the heads of some of the banks that he would later bail out after the crisis. The subsequent tribunal and report, led by Alan Marr, a judge in Ireland, recommended a complete revision to the ethics system that would require more regular disclosure of conflict of interest and revised asset disclosures. The recommendations were included in the last Ireland OGP action plan, and the new ethics system in Ireland that's now in place should prevent this type of political party financing and conflict of interest that did so much damage to the country. And finally, in Mongolia, one of the most extractive industry-dependent countries in the world, there's been a recent move to put all environmental information related to extractive industry projects in open data formats, online and shareable. A huge step forward for Mongolia. The thing that all those three stories have in common is that they relied on a huge role for citizens and civil society. both in putting forward the ideas that actually ended up being implemented, but also in an advocacy and campaigning role to make sure political leaders were held accountable, but then also given credit when they did the right thing. And across OGP's 69 countries, we're seeing really interesting new forms of collaboration between citizens, civil society, and government. So in over half our countries now, there is actually a permanent dialogue with different levels of formality, or a forum or a council, where civil society and government are meeting regularly to discuss open government priorities and really co-create the agenda. And I was asked just to give a few examples. So in Colombia, the government has actually set up thematic roundtables. So it's not under the label open government, it's roundtables on education, on health, on gender, on the environment, bringing in non-usual suspects from civil society, moving beyond the people that would attend conferences like this, people that won't necessarily be there because they think open government is something they're working on, even though they absolutely are, but because they want a more responsive, transparent, and accountable system. In Georgia, the government have actually gone beyond the executive branch, and the parliament have done their own plan, a legislative openness plan to shine a light again on donations and political party financing, but also to allow citizens to participate in the lawmaking process. And in Mexico, one of the most advanced forms of cooperation we've seen in OGP, they have a formalized tripartite system where civil society organizations directly elect 8 members to sit on a council alongside the Autonomous Access to Information Commission and government officials from different departments, and they co-own and co-create the open government agenda in Mexico. So that's one of the most ambitious examples that we've seen. So what does all this mean for Canada? Canada is clearly not Ukraine or Georgia or Ireland even. But I wanted to leave you with, I guess, 3 ideas to move forward. The first, internationally, we desperately need political leaders to make the case for open government internationally. It's very easy to be pessimistic if you look at the direction that many countries are taken. And sadly, in many places in the world, civil society and citizens are experiencing a dramatic closing of space. Laws have been passed to restrict foreign funding, to curtail freedom of the press, and activists have been locked up in jail, even, I'm sad to say, in some of our OGP countries. So I don't think we can afford to be complacent. Despite the fact I think the momentum is with us, we absolutely need Canada playing an international leadership role on this agenda. And I think to some extent that's happened on open data. Canada has actually chaired one of our working groups on open data, but I think it can go much further. And of course, that being said, every country in OGP, regardless of your level of development, has something they can improve on. We recently published our second independent report on progress on open government issues in Canada. And I'm glad to say that 2 of the recommendations of the report were actually addressed by Minister Bryson yesterday, which was to include open government in the budget and to put in place a process of reforming access to information. But there were other recommendations in that report, including on working with civil society in a more formalized way. And I think that would be a very interesting outcome or something for this group to think about, which is what would be appropriate in the Canadian context in terms of setting up something a bit more formal where government and civil society can come together regularly to talk about these issues. And to that end, I wanted to congratulate James and Jean Noé and others who have set up the Canadian Open Government Civil Society Network and really encourage people to participate in that and take ownership over it. And there is now an opportunity to also participate in the consultation that Minister Bryson launched yesterday. That will feed into Canada's 3rd OGP plan. And I know there are already big ideas that have been discussed here around, for example, extending open contracting and including proactive disclosure of all contracts and using that data to inform evidence-based policymaking, around prioritizing the release of data sets that really matter to citizens and civil society, and many other ideas that you'll know far better than I do. The final message is we need to take this to the local level, to the subnational level. For me, it's been an incredible learning experience to hear from people from all over the country talking about their approaches to open government and how varied and different they are based on the different traditions and cultures of each of the parts of Canada. So much is already happening. OGP was set up to deal primarily with executive branches, but what we realized is that open government, if it's to really matter to citizens, then we need to take it to all levels of government. This year we launched a pilot program to work with local government authorities. We had over 40 applications, and I would like to congratulate Ontario and Premier Wynne and Deputy Premier Matthews for being one of the first applicants to this OGP pilot program. And I hope we'll have some good news in the coming week or two when we publish the final list of the 15 that have been accepted. So in conclusion, I think there is obviously a huge opportunity for Canadian governments at all levels to lead on this agenda. If there's one thing I would think is, if I was being hypercritical, that I felt was missing a bit from the last day and a half, is just an understanding that transparency and openness are deeply political issues. Like, they absolutely challenge vested interests. They take power away from elites, they put it in the hands of the many, and they're about changing the culture of government. So I don't think you can ever be complacent and think these things will happen automatically. They require fundamental political leadership and a fundamental change to the way that government and citizens work together. And it's about being less reactive and more proactive about disclosing information. So used well, I think OGP can be a tool, a platform, a place where all the reformers who are in this room can work together to make potentially transformative changes to Canadian society and to step up leadership internationally. But ultimately, it's over to you guys, and it's in your hands. Thank you.
Great. So we have a little while for conversation, and I wanted to kick things off with you, Joe. In preparing for this, I read this great IRPP, our Institute for Research on Public Policy piece, written by James McKinney and Bernard Rudney. And they really emphasize both the open data piece as well as access to information. I'd love to ask you, benchmarking Canada against some of your global experiences, where are we on those two specific issues? And as a bureaucrat who's had to wade through hours of access to information requests, I can assure you there's interest in an easier process from inside government too.
So we're explicitly prohibited from ranking any country.
Are you really?
It's in our articles of governance, yeah.
Okay.
It's, I think if you wanted as diverse a group of countries
like hot, cold.
Exactly, yeah. We leave that to others, but I mean, I think this was something we were talking about last night as well. There seems to be, I guess, in the early stages of OGP, a kind of odd siloing of the access to information community who had campaigned around these issues for many decades, who really understood it had to be rooted in law and legal frameworks and institutions, and then an open data community who were obviously newer and were more interested in the technology and side and kind of more, I guess, from a sort of hacker background. I think what we're hoping is to see those two communities converge a lot more, because you cannot have meaningful open data sets being released of the types that were highlighted in that article unless you have a solid legal framework on access to information, unless you have an archive system that is really funded and supported. And I think one of the other recommendations we have in our report is, how do you think about archiving when so much is digital? What type of new frameworks do you have to put in place to ensure that we don't have huge gaps in our record because we don't have things that are locked in Soviet archives? So I think the idea of bringing those two together and making sure that, as Minister Bryson said yesterday, the access to information law is updated here, that actually it includes from the outset all the principles around open data that we know need to be there. So
you've probably heard the quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what that means is you can have all kinds of rules, you can have all kinds of laws, and we should absolutely aim, frankly, in Canada, for the best laws in the world. And I think we've discovered through our conversations here, and we'll keep working on that we have work to do. But you need to have a culture that supports that. From my activity inside government, I can tell you that I really feel strongly that the bureaucracy really believes that the information belongs to Canadians. Like there's a good culture of openness. So my own experience with access to information has been that people are very diligent about producing records, going through them carefully. But what I wanted to just pick your brains about is, how do we get at that culture piece where information management isn't just seen as the rules, but it's kind of seen as how we are supposed to do things as civil servants?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to come from the top.
Okay.
So one of the things that I guess keep us up at night is how fragile in many countries in the world this agenda feels. It's one or two reforming ministers, a handful of officials who really get this. I think this conference clearly illustrates Canada is not one of those places where it's fragile and a change of administration could suddenly see it backsliding. So if you have that depth of commitment from the official level, I think what you need is the political leadership to create space for them to do their jobs.
I think sometimes we underestimate the value we have in our public institutions in Canada. And traveling internationally, I've heard people speak quite a bit about the inspiration that they can derive from seeing places with good practice. What would you encourage Canada to be doing more of globally?
So as I said to Minister Bryson yesterday, I think we would love to see Canada engaging in a leadership position in OGP beyond the excellent work that's happened in open data.
What would that entail specifically?
We have an international steering committee of 11 governments and 11 civil society leaders. Currently the chairs are the governments of France and South Africa and the World Resources Institute and HESOC, which is a small NGO in Mexico. Governments are elected to that position by their peers. And I think it would be interesting in the next year or two for Canada to consider running for a seat on the steering committee.
So I'm from the Department of Finance. We always ask, how much is this going to cost us? But in all seriousness, does it need more money? Does it need more leadership? Does it need all of the above?
Yeah.
I'm just going to probe you a little bit more about what that would mean for Canada. And should we be, I'm making this up, should we be concentrating on a region where we have quite a bit of influence, like the Francophonie, or in Africa? Should we be focusing on Latin and South America? Should we be partnering? Let's just push us a little here.
So I think there are many countries who are not yet part of OGP, and we need countries like Canada to help make the case for them to join. And actually the Francophonie has been one of our weak spots, and I also in the piece that you referenced earlier is a good point on official languages. So I think we're very strong in Latin America. Very few countries in Latin America are not members of OGP.
Really?
But we have a big gap in West Africa. And I think partly that is language. Partly that's also because we have eligibility criteria to join. So not anybody can join OGP. We have 90 countries who I think are now eligible, of which 69 are signed up. Germany's not a member. It's not just developing countries. There are some big advanced democracies who have also not joined. So I think also making sure that when Canada is chairing the G7 or the G20 or whatever it is, to make sure that open government is on the agenda and actually discussed between leaders, because I think it is a conversation that needs to happen at that level.
So in all seriousness, also too for your secretariat, you need to hire a bunch of Canadians, that's obvious. Who I like to say we're type O blood. You can add us to any organization and we make things better.
I have requested a secondment from the Treasury Board Secretariat, so...
I think, no, seriously, in all seriousness, and that person, should be French, and that person should be able to build some of those bridges with the Francophonie. If that was a follow-up that we could help you deliver on as a result of this conference, I think that'd be very substantive. So I also, I'm very active at the World Economic Forum, and they do rank countries. And I have to tell you, it does push countries. So we're on a global competitiveness index that's been going on for more than a decade that Jeffrey Schott and now Jennifer Blanque, the chief economist there, have started. Have you thought about having open government as one of the criteria for government competitiveness? Should it be? Because, we talked I think, a little bit about yesterday about the unlocked potential and the value that open data can deliver into the business sector.
I mean, I would personally like to see open government become much more integrated into a whole host of indexes and also lending. You know, if you're the IMF and the World Bank and you're providing huge multi-billion-dollar loans and grants, if you embed the open government kind of values within that, you know, that's far more meaningful than if you have a few pots of $1 million that countries can help apply to for specific projects, because then you actually are you're saying that, you know, having effective institutions, having feedback loops, involving citizens in policy making are not optional, right? They're actually part of what's expected if you're going to access these types of international instruments.
I was also thinking, you know, it would be interesting for a couple of countries, maybe like Canada, that believe passionately about, in this, to sort of say, yeah, we want to be benchmarked on this, and then we want to actually demonstrate the economic value of open government as a demonstration effect.
Yeah, and I think that's something Edwin and others at the OECD have been doing, these type of peer reviews where they have been bringing countries together to assess each other. The way we do accountability is we have a national researcher, Mary Francoli, who's based at Carleton. I really encourage people to have a look at the report she just put out. It's a really interesting report, very fair, I think. And that also, she has a section in there on the national context where she does bring in some of these other issues around the kind of business argument and competitiveness and so on. And I think one of our weaknesses, frankly, has been it would be great to see more businesses and chambers of commerce involved in OGP consultations, because I think they have not only as the subject of anti-corruption or whatever it is, but also as one of the users and one of the people that demand some of these cultural changes from government for their own businesses.
So I read her report in preparation for our discussion, and I was really struck by that same point about the role of business being a little bit underdeveloped, if you will. Could you just unpack that for us? Like you said, having chambers of commerce involved, should they also be having kind of their own reporting standards or their own practices in this area? Is it about them being transparent in their relationships with government? What would that entail?
Yeah, I mean, so we've struggled with this idea of if you open up OGP wholesale to the private sector, how do you have an eligibility criteria for the private sector? You know, do you allow Shell to join, even though Shell has taken the US government to court on an OGP commitment on mandatory disclosure of extractive industry payments to governments? You know, so where do you draw the line? Because I think you would have, you would need to have some kind of way of saying, yes, there is value to be had from this conversation, but at the same time, recognizing that for a lot of civil society organizations, what they want to see in OGP plans are things that prevent corruption and certain practices that may be actually undermining a change in culture in the government.
So there's a group of issues around corruption, for sure, payments, transparency, and you talked about the Irish example in your discussion. I think one of the challenges for business too is that they want to protect commercially sensitive information for competitiveness reasons, which makes perfect sense. Proprietary information. Have you entered into dialogue with some of the larger multinationals? Have you seen, what are they telling you are there areas of interest and then some of their concerns with open government?
I mean, I think we need to do a lot more. It's been some with Google, but really not that advanced. And I think as
so that's an area for further
absolutely
kind of work.
Yeah, and also I think explaining to people that open government and privacy don't have to be in opposition. You can actually, people having ownership over their data is not, in a sense that should be part of open government, right? It shouldn't be seen.
Absolutely.
And I think this is where, frankly speaking, why Germany hasn't joined OGP is because they have very strong privacy concerns. So I think that needs to be developed further, and there are foundations like the Amidiar Network and others who are doing a lot of amazing thinking on this. But
sorry, what was the group?
The Amidiar Network.
Amidiar?
Yeah, the founder of eBay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So. Great. I have a few more questions for Joe, but I really would invite all of you. There's 2 brains up here and probably about 200 out there. So please join us. There's 2 mics here, and I'll start recognizing people as they walk up. but I wanted to ask you about an issue that's close to my heart, which is fiscal transparency. So transparency in budgeting. Where have you seen some good practices on that issue, and what do you think citizens want on the sort of fiscal transparency side of things?
It's a good question. I'm by no means a policy expert on this. I mean, the Open Budget Survey does rank countries, and South Africa, I think, has been top for the past 2 years. So I think in the end, it may not be citizens writ large, but it may be intermediaries who want to follow the money. They want to know,
Absolutely.
they want to have open spending linked to procurement, linked to infrastructure projects, and be able to see where their dollars are going. I think that's a kind of fundamental thing that any government should be doing now.
Great, good, please. And please introduce yourself.
Okay, yes, it's on. Dave Fraser from the National Research Council. Sounds like your organization is doing great work, and clearly you're very sincere. On the photo of the announcement of the OPG, I thought I saw the president of Brazil. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about your eligibility criteria and how you also monitor ongoing behavior. Thanks.
That sounds like an easy question.
So interestingly, the lead government department on OGP in Brazil is the Comptroller General's office. And if you know much about Brazil, you know the Comptroller General is the person responsible for prosecuting the senators who are alleged to have taken bribes from Petrobras. So you can look at Brazil one of two ways. You can either say, actually, this is accountability in action. The former president having a judge ruling against him and serious kind of concerns about whether President Dilma can carry on. That is accountability at the highest level. So it's not to say that everything is perfect in Brazil, but I think it would be far more worrying if there weren't some kind of accountability check actually happening. And as I said, the team that we work with are on the front lines. I mean, they don't pick up the phone to me anymore. They are absolutely spending their time trying to resolve this Petrobras case.
Please.
Maureen O'Neill, Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement. Along the same lines, what is the relationship between your organization and Transparency International?
So in many of our countries, Transparency International are one of the lead civil society organizations who participate in the consultation, who put forward ideas for the OGP action plan. One of their secretariat leads from Berlin has actually, I think, is applying to be on our steering committee when we do the next rotation. So it's a very close relationship, and I think quite rightly, Transparency International push us to go further. They ask the difficult questions about Brazil. They ask questions around whether certain countries that shall remain nameless who have hundreds of political prisoners should be part of OGP. And I think we need to be held to account because we're a relatively young, small, almost like a startup international organization. So we don't have the hard law and the history of someone like the UN. Everything's kind of soft and emerging. So we need that pressure to make sure that our feet are held to the fire as well.
We have a question here from Twitter. Gary Lee says, you've made the point, Joe, that openness and transparency are deeply political, and they redistribute power. Can we, and when you say, can we let it go, I'm going to take that to mean, can we push transparency? What would the process for that be?
I think everyone in the room could answer whether they can let go better than I can. I think, as I said before, if you have political leadership which opens the space, then lots of things become possible. And I think one of our...
Or we don't wait for them.
Yeah.
We keep agitating. I mean, I don't know if anyone's read, for example, the AFN Perry Bellegarde report, Closing the Gap. I mean, we know we have a huge gap between our First Nation citizens and the rest of Canada, and I think we all know that's unacceptable. They're not going to wait. I mean, we have to get moving on stuff like that. So I think that, to your point, leadership is really important, and all of these, sort of citizen pieces. It's really interesting, by the way. It's a very digitally connected First Nations community who's demographically very young, and I think we're seeing the way social media is creating new tools that are really deepening our democracy, you know, as opposed to this sort of like march to the ballot box once every 4 years. We don't have that tradition. Maybe I can, and we're going to go to the mic here, but you know, we don't have a very strong sort of ongoing referendum democracy in Canada. I'd say British Columbia may be our closest example. Oh, you're from BC, great.
I wasn't going to comment. I was actually going to ask a question about the economics of all this. So you're from finance, and you know that we've had some kind of macroeconomic analysis about what the real numbers are around the economic opportunities created by this openness, right? The challenge that I've encountered in talking about some of those numbers is that they tend to be coming from very specialized interests, right? The McKinseys, the Deloittes, and others, right? And who have an interest in being able to tell that story. And there's nothing against those guys. But what I'm wondering is where we're seeing, or if we're seeing, some of the economic analysis that kind of puts a number on the opportunity here that is maybe a bit more objective than what we're seeing from research organizations or from governments. I know the Canadian federal government has done some great work around the opportunities created by open geospatial information.
Yep.
But you know, for people like me who are working at a subnational level and trying to drive an agenda forward, it's really difficult to have a conversation with a Treasury board about moving things ahead and costs without much sense of return. And I'm wondering whether or not there's much going on in that space internationally, Joe.
Mm-hmm. I can answer for Canada. One of our concerns, or one of the challenges that we have, is that measuring services and the things that come out of data, for example, in services in our NAICS code, in the way that we measure economic activity is really challenging. So I don't know if you know Danielle Goldfarb at the Conference Board of Canada. She's been doing some work, you know, on trying to value services. But I think the conversation actually goes back to Statistics Canada. And we had a little conversation about the importance of reimagining Statistics Canada with Tom Jenkins yesterday. But more, frankly, it's going to take more money and attention on that particular set of economic activity to codify it, to measure it. And I think we should absolutely commit to that. And you're right, having that sort of third party, like having someone like Statistics Canada putting that data out there, where then and they do very effective analyses of various economic sectors. So they know what to do. It's more of a measurement challenge. So I think unpacking that piece, and I'm sure we have people from Statistics Canada joining us, and James Baldwin and others who have worked on the productivity questions for years, I think should be at the epicenter of this conversation. But your point is really well taken. Like the consultancies have their own information and are very much on the vanguard of kind of driving the conversation. We should then also have just kind of generally available data to support that conversation. But the point is it's hard.
Well, yeah.
Getting data, getting services data.
I don't have it. I'd love it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
why I'm asking. It
Yeah.
is hard. Joe, is there something internationally that you're seeing?
You know, ironically, Germany has some of the best
Yeah.
services and foreign direct investment data, and so we've got some work to do with their statistical agency and others to kind of mirror what they're doing.
I mean, I feel one of the biggest general gaps for open government is we are still searching for some of the stories of impact, or even if it's not impact, because people get very queasy about impact, but like early results, or we need to be able to have some shared stories and a narrative where we can talk about these issues in a way that is convincing for different audiences. And one of those audiences will be the finance ministry. Another of those audiences will be obviously citizens and civil society. So I think, you know, if there's something that could also come out of this gathering, is if there were a way of collecting some of the different examples that are happening across Canada and be able to share them. I think that would be a big step forward, because I certainly feel like we're clinging on to a few of the same examples, the McKinsey report and others, and we could do much better.
Mm-hmm. Is there something driving your concern in British Columbia? Is there an area of focus, or?
Well, I mean, I just think it's, well, there's a president of the Treasury Board right there, right? So here's the real conversation is how much will this cost, and is the juice worth the squeeze? And on the public service side, if we're wishy-washy, you've probably been there. If you're wishy-washy about what that looks like, it's probably going to be no sale.
Yep.
So it's a really important component of the sustainability of this work in meeting its potential, because what will happen is we will go through a startup phase where we're bootstrapping this and we're using existing resources, but we will become less and less relevant and targeted
Without
as
proof of concept.
and we'll get stalled there unless we're able to develop a narrative and some real data points about whether the kind of impact that we're going to have. So, like if it's not the right kind of analogy, but like we can measure the economic efficiency created by a tax credit, right, or regulatory relief. Like, can we figure out the model that allows us to see what sort of transaction costs drop when we're releasing this information for businesses and others, and then, model out the economic impact of something like that. So that's all.
Great.
Thanks.
Sounds like we need StatsCan. Do we have any StatsCan folks in the room? If you're here, and if you're not, I'm going to just call you at home. So, but we should be thinking about what pilots we can drive on this, and I think we probably have some. I saw Toby Nussbaum here from the city of Ottawa. I think we probably have some pretty concrete examples at the city level, which are a little bit easier to wrap our hands around. And then I think we can work with Waterloo and some of their open data work to at least model out some pilots. I think that's totally doable. Yeah. Hi.
On this question, the government of Mexico has actually asked the OECD to look at the impact of open government data and to try to measure that. And so we're looking at both economic as well as governance and social impacts. And it is
Are you looking at it in a sector or macro, or tell us a little bit about your study?
So what we've done is we've had groups with private sector where we're asking them what is the reuse and what is the value of the reuse of that data. So it's what we're trying to do is to test a framework in Mexico that we can then look at other countries as well.
Neat.
But what we're finding is that there are big gaps and that there's some kind of heroic assumptions that we have to make in order, but at least it can give us sort of a
start.
sense, a start.
Yeah.
It's a starting point, exactly. And what we've seen there is that because it's the Presidencia, it's the head of the national government strategy, that digital strategy that's asking for this, they're the ones that are able to provide the leadership and to bring people to the table. Because otherwise, this is not something that a couple of experts in a room are going to be able to figure out. You have to have a broad discussion because you have to search out the people who are doing the reuse, and that's the only way you're going to be able to get that estimate. Otherwise, it's really a theoretical number that you're coming up with. But I actually had a different question, which was that, Joe, you made a really good case about the need to broaden membership in the OGP, but I wanted to know if you could say something about how we deepen the participation beyond sort of the true believers and to get other sectors in. And just to give you an example, the G20 anti-corruption working group recently adopted principles on open data for anti-corruption. And this is, literally there were people around the table reading speeches. Open data is very important. And they would say to us afterwards, I know nothing about open data, but this is just something that we've been told is important. So how do you get that awareness into areas like anti-corruption, budgeting, procurement, because that's where you're really going to get the big benefits.
So one idea on that is, so in September, the UN agreed the new Sustainable Development Goals to replace the Millennium Development Goals. So 17 agreed by heads of state, and the whole idea behind moving to Sustainable Development Goals was that they would be universally implemented. It wasn't going to be a north-south, aid-driven thing as with the MDGs, but actually every country, UK, Canada, down to the poorest countries in the world, would have to implement them themselves. And one of the most interesting examples in OGP we've seen since then is the US actually committing to release sensitive police data with absolutely relevant to the Black Lives Matter campaign and the issues that have been going on in many American cities. And they've put that as part of their domestic implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals around access to justice in Goal 16. So one idea, I think, to broaden it would be to say, well, every country has to set their own national indicators to meet these 17 goals. How about we see where open government intersects with the delivery of those? Because I certainly feel like across, whether it's environment and climate or gender or health or education, there is an open government dimension to all of these things, and that might allow us to get more line ministries involved, more sector-specific civil society, as I said before, who don't necessarily think in the terms of open government, but actually bring them to the table. And that framework won't necessarily work well everywhere, but I think it's one idea that we've had for kind of trying to broaden and deepen within countries.
I think you make a really interesting point there that we have to leverage, frankly, as a country with limited resources and choices, we also have to make sure that we're leveraging the investments that we're making in international institutions like the UN, the G20, the World Economic Forum, and then drive those into this open government commitment. So, I think surfacing some of the synergies between these activities and making this international activity really meaningful is really essential. So we're going to take one last question, and then I think we're moving on to our next sessions.
Great, thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Eilish, and thank you, Joe, as well. I guess the one thing that I've found remarkable over the past day and a half or so is really illustrated by the photograph behind you. It's a photograph of a gentleman taking a photo, I believe, of Parliament. And we're meeting here in Ottawa. And over the course of a day and a half, I don't think I've heard any mention of Parliament or all 14 of our legislative assemblies across the country. Joe, I heard you mention, the risk of having democracy only for the elites and a shift of power. And I guess perhaps building on David's point, I wonder, again, whether we're talking about, on the open dialogue sector, not on the data, not on the information, the open dialogue sector, whether we're talking about the potential for a complementary theory of democracy or a competing theory of democracy. And I worry that we're actually talking about a competing theory of democracy. We've worked really hard in this country, and in many other of them, sure, the 69 countries, for the past 200 or so years to develop responsible government, to expand the franchise, to put in place campaign finance laws so that we do have an equality of participation through a system of representative democracy, which I understand is being challenged, and I think I understand the reasons why it's being challenged. But I don't think we can necessarily have a conversation about open dialogue and divorce ourselves from the institutions we've actually created to have an open dialogue where all citizens are represented, in this case through the 338 representatives that they duly elected. So I just wonder if I could get comment from you on how the open dialogue movement fits with the systems of governments in the 69 countries that have signed on.
It's obviously a huge question.
I feel the book coming on.
I mean, I think I would, for me, open government strengthens democracy. It's not about a competing vision. I think it's about strengthening and updating the democracy that we have. So we have new tools available to us, digital tools, that allow people to engage their members of parliament directly. We have websites that monitor votes and put that information out in a much more simple to understand format. And we, in France, they even had they put a draft law on GitHub and invited people to make comments on it as they were drafting. So I think some of these tools are actually about strengthening democracy, but I of course agree with you that members of parliament have to be involved in this conversation. And actually some of the most ambitious reforms that have been committed to through OGP have not been delivered because they were the executive branch promising things that then the legislative branch refused to pass. Access to information in Tanzania, Philippines, Ghana, and many other places.
So deepening this out into the legislative community, but I think also we have a huge opportunity to digitize our parliaments, make them more accessible, and I think that's a really important part of the conversation that you've introduced. So please join me in thanking Joseph for an absolutely fascinating discussion, and good luck with your ongoing work. Thanks.
Thank you.